flashes. 1 second. Okay, excellent.
Good.
And okay, Ellen, can you see my screen?
I can, yes. Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. Oh, here, let me
You're good.
admit this. Here we go. Okay. So we had 38 registrants for this evening's training, which I am just so thrilled by. And thank you so much to all of you for being here this evening. There's some very important work ahead. So really looking forward to working with all of you and getting to know each of you better as we continue on. So thanks again for being here. We plan this evening to discuss with you how to start an ID clinic wherever you are. So again, yes, the primary goal tonight is that you would come away kind of understanding the best practices that we are aware of for starting a Missouri state ID and birth certificate clinic. We will give you an overview of the process to obtain the birth certificates and IDs, though that will be a smaller portion of tonight's training, and that would be expanded upon as you get started with the clinic and are starting to train volunteers. And lastly, we hope to start building relationships in this community and create a statewide network among all of us who are offering this service. So there's more to come on that. Tonight, we obviously don't have a whole lot of time to start getting to know each other other than in the chat. But later this week, we will have a follow-up, and I'll say more about that later, where we will begin to try to create like a monthly space where we can come together and get to know each other and talk through all of this. Next slide.
And it would help if I could find the unmute button. So just a brief overview of what we're going to do tonight. And like Madeline said, we are going to try to do this in an hour and a half. So we should go until about 7:30 tonight. We understand that maybe some of the notifications that went out said 6 to 7, and we really think that maybe is a little overzealous here of how quickly we can do this. So if you need to jump off at 7, I will try really hard to not take it personally, and we'll be sure to follow up with the recording. But we're going to spend 90 minutes tonight together. We'll start with an introduction both of the St. Francis Xavier College Church ID and birth certificate program, which Madeline is involved with, and the Ashrei Foundation clinics, which I'm involved with. We are going to talk through how our clinics work, how our programs work, and give some sort of recommendations and guidance for what we think might be helpful for how you can start a clinic where you are, or an ID program where you are. I'm going to use clinic and program a little bit interchangeably here. And then like Madeline just referenced, we are going to go through a little like top line overview of the actual document processing. So if you are looking for that, that's going to be in like a train the trainer sort of follow-up program, or if you have or intend to volunteer at one of our programs, then you can attend one of those volunteer trainings. But rather than try to put all of that in tonight, we're going to break that part off into later. But we'll give you an overview so you have kind of a general sense. And then we are going to make sure that you have plenty of time for questions and answers. But again, trying to keep us within the time for tonight. The last thing I quickly want to mention is that I think at this point, many of us, this is not our first Zoom, so I'm going to go through these quickly, but we are hoping that everyone can be present and participate tonight. I am not a lecturer, and I prefer to have conversations and dialogue, which I know is hard when we're on Zoom. So things that are really helpful for me is using the chat to give feedback, using the reactions button in Zoom, hand gestures, hopefully nice ones, right, that you could share so that I know that you're not zoning out and wishing that you were doing something else, but that you actually want to be here and that we're doing something that you think is helpful and supportive. The other thing, this is a co-learning environment. So we both have some experience that we want to share. And we are not the only experts in this room, and we know that each one of you comes here with experience and expertise of your own. And so we're hoping this can be a space to share and build the relationships that can grow this work statewide. I am also doing my best to get over a non-COVID related cold or flu or something. So I'm going to try not to hack on camera. I'm going to mute as best as I can to remain present in this space. Lastly, let's see, step up, step back. If you're not familiar with that, let's just be mindful of the ways that people learn. And so I'm usually the person that raises my hand until the teacher is like, Sarah, put your hand down. I'm not going to answer on it anymore. And I know that I have beloved friends who are terrified to raise their hand in class. So that being said, let's make sure that we are stepping up when we need to be heard and stepping back so that others can be heard throughout tonight. This is a dignity first space and conversation and project for me personally. So for me, that means asking challenging questions around equity, digging down to find what are the values that we are trying to express and live into as we do this work. And those things not only show up in the work that we're planning, but show up right now as we are building relationships together in order to do this work in our communities. So I would just ask that you treat each other with that kind of compassion and respect that we are hoping to build statewide. And I think I mentioned timing, so we're good to go.
Thanks. So I'll give you a quick little background on the program at College Church. So again, I'm Madeline Powers. I'm currently serving as the Regional Access Coordinator, which is a new position that has sort of been born out of what was last year called the Mobile Outreach Coordinator. And basically, as our program has grown over time, we have seen that we cannot meet the need that exists in St. Louis. And if that's happening in St. Louis, certainly it's happening across the state. So the program has dedicated resources to trying to help build this program out, decentralize from the College Church space, and have others join us in the work. The program began in 1993, so we're coming up on 30 years, which is wild. We operate weekly in the mornings, 9 a.m. to what used to be 12:30, but again, we are just seeing more than we can handle. So we very recently scaled back to 11:30. We see close to 4,000 people in a year, which was specifically 3,861 this past fiscal year. And there's a whole lot more to say, which we'll get into, but you can learn more about our program through the website that's listed there.
So the Ashrei Foundation, Madeline, I'm sorry, did you introduce yourself yet?
I just did.
Okay, great. I maybe was hacking on that, but I think we didn't do it at the beginning. So I was like, oh, we should do that. So I'm Sarah Ruiz. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the executive director at the Ashrei Foundation. Some of you might know that Ashrei is a Hebrew word that means to move forward, often misunderstood, I have been taught. And we were founded by Rabbi Susan Talvi of Central Reform Congregation just earlier this year. So we're little babies in this particular space, but I'm sure several of you know Rabbi Susan, and not quite babies in broader social justice work, but in this new iteration of us. So we have come into this space really looking at how we can inject capacity into gaps that exist in our community already. So the how that we got involved into this work was being in relationship with Pastor Andre Alexander and folks at the Hub, the Tabernacle Hub in North St. Louis City, being in some spaces, learning about democracy, access to democracy, changing laws and policies, how communities are coming together, build congregation, community-led spaces. And then all of a sudden it was like, I know these two people from these two different spaces, and they're both saying, I have this thing that can meet this need, and I have this need, but we don't have capacity to bring the thing here. And that's where Ashrei was like, maybe we can inject some capacity into that and connect those dots. So it's really cool for me to be in this space with you all, because I didn't make any of this up, and being able to work with St. Francis and adapt what they've already created, and then see how our process continues to learn and fuel each other seems really cool, just like baseline. And as we'll talk later tonight about the changing context of how important this work has become in the last couple of months. We have hosted St. Francis for 2 trainings in July and August. We've had 2 clinics. Our first one was 3 days ago. And now we are working on improving. sustaining and adding additional hours is in terms of weekday walk-in hour, weekday appointment only hours. The 2 clinics we've had are walk-in only, no appointments.
All right, here we go, the official start.
Sorry about that. So I think what our plan is that we're going to go through sort of the who, what, when, where, how. We're going to try to give you as much information as we can about how Madeline has come into the program at St. Francis, how we've started a new iteration of it. And then we're going to try to give you some questions that will help, are intended to help you in starting your own program. So some of that means we're making assumptions about who you are and where you come from in terms of organizations or non-government agencies, maybe congregations, and that might not be spot on. So I think we're going to try to speak in big strokes and give big questions so that maybe throughout the evening and through some of the follow-up conversations that we hope to have with you all, we can go into some finer details. So hoping to get into enough detail without going too deep this evening.
Great. So I'll start and I'll try to hit each of these bullet points with a little bit of context for the specific work we're doing at College Church. I will probably use, or you will hear College Church, St. Francis Xavier, St. Francis, all interchangeably. So I'm sorry if that gets a little confusing. But anyway, staffing is where we'll start. The church itself has a whole social ministry arm, and we have a director of social ministry, and underneath that, there is a program coordinator for the outreach program, which is our our Tuesday programming. And that person serves 20 hours a week. And then there are additional, and the director is a full-time staff. There are additional supports in place. Currently, we have an AmeriCorps Vista who helps us with the communications. And then my role is also a 20-hour-a-week role. And then the last thing underneath that would be all of the volunteers we try to recruit. So none of that would be paid. When talking about partnerships, we're talking about, goodness, now I'm realizing I kind of forget what we were, because we have these all listed out on the slides that come ahead or are coming up ahead, but we wanted to share them all at once now. And this is, so anyway, partnerships is we have relationships with the Vital Records Office downtown, the Department of Revenue, and specifically the DMVs that are local to us. The logistics in our space, we are operating currently out of the basement of the church, which is our like a ballroom space, and we have it's basically a pop-up event every time. We have to set up the chairs and tables every single week for that, and it's a communal space that gets used for all kinds of different things. So we have like a big cart that carries our internet and our all the iPads that we end up using, and the printers, which falls later in equipment and technology. I touched on the program hours already, but we see people from 9 a.m. when we begin until noon, but we say we close at 11:30 so that we are sure that whenever or whoever gets to us will be seen, and gives us a little window to make sure that happens. It is first come, first serve. We also have the ability to make appointments. So both walk-in and appointments are accepted. And generally we don't get too many appointments anyway. And probably like of the, probably half of them end up making it. So just that's a way that it can be done. We'll get a little bit into finances. There's a very big budget for College Church currently because that's our main service. But we'll have some kind of ideas for like what you might be able to consider as you get started. Service communication. So that looks like the flyer that we have for our program. That's kind of our main form of communication, and we push that out through the social service network locally. So the continuum of care, we also kind of have a sense of the kind of key social service agencies that you rely on us for their participants. So we'll be in communication with them. We use Facebook, and then the parish bulletin as well. And the volunteer recruitment can kind of happens in a similar way through the parish bulletin. But we also have the benefit of being on SLU's campus. So at the beginning of the year, there's like a volunteer fair. So our program coordinator just went to that, and hopefully we'll see some people from that. Thank you.
Yeah, in our program, so I can kind of run down that list for what it looks like at the Ashrei Foundation. So currently, we're in what I am calling a 6-month pilot program. So trying to sort of test the water to see if doing this program in these ways at this location makes sense in St. Louis, given that College Church already has a really long-standing and pretty big program of who and how many they can serve and when they serve. But we kept hearing that there's a need for it. And so that being said, currently, I am a full-time 40-hour-a-week director of the whole nonprofit, and this is part of what we do. So the amount of hours that I spend sort of like per week on this program ebbs and flows. If we're leading up to a clinic like we were on this past Saturday, most of last week, this is what I did. But then there are weeks sort of in between that I'm spending maybe 20 hours in the before and the after in the prep and communications. We certainly rely on volunteers. So this for us is a volunteer-led program. Shout out to some of the volunteers who are on the call right now and who were with me on Saturday. And so I think trying to get a sense of how big and how much we'll need depends on how many volunteers we need, depends on how we design the program moving forward. For us, the partnerships have been key. So since we are not at a parish or a congregation like St. Francis, we are leveraging relationships with other congregations and other partners. So as I mentioned, we're at the Hub, which is a resource center in North City that is managed by Tabernacle Church and the Tabernacle Community Development Corporation. So we're in deep relationship with them, and then several other sort of ecumenical and interfaith networks in the city, trying to make sure that we are leveraging those networks both for outreach for people that might need the service and for people who can help deliver this service moving forward. So the partnerships on our end have been really key for being informed and moving into this space in an equitable way. Space logistics, as I mentioned, we're out of the Hub, which is a beautifully renovated, it's in an old St. Louis City elementary school that looks nothing like a St. Louis City elementary school at this point. We've done it in 2 different spots, in 2 different spaces, but similarly to what Madeline said, this is a set up tables and chairs each time, take it all down each time after that. So it's bringing a lot in and then taking it all down. We have a locked office there, so when we take it down, we leave our stuff in the office there. But things like printers, we schlep everywhere, and Wi-Fi is in the building, so we're thankful for that. Program hours for us currently are just once a month, clinic walk-in only. By the end of this month, maybe starting in October, we'll be able to launch weekday appointment only hours. So that's another sort of capacity point for us of volunteer coordination to make sure that I have volunteers that can be in the office at times that we can open for appointments. So we're hoping to grow that as we move forward. Equipment and technology, we made an initial investment. We'll get into that in a little bit different than what Madeline did, given the fact that we're still sort of testing the waters. We didn't want to, just buy 10 iPads if we were going to run this for 6 months and be like, well, guess we don't need to do this anymore, right? So that didn't seem like a good choice. So we are doing it slightly different. And I'll talk more about finances when we get there. And I think that's pretty much all I would say. Nothing too different at this point for the other points. So let's dive in a little bit deeper in terms of how things work at College Church, how things work at Ashrei, and then the questions that might work for you. So I think we kind of talked about how our staffing models worked in terms of some paid staff, some trained volunteers, definitely notaries who are volunteering, and then certainly at SLU, right, a VISTA position or a coordinator position. I think both of our models rely on having at least one staff person who can be a point or 2 points in terms of communication and volunteer coordination, because day of logistics are pretty significant. So just moving into considerations, how much time we want to think about this. Madeline, can I pass to you? Sorry.
That's all right. Yeah, so the way that we will continue, we'll have a model slide, which will just be a lot of what we have said. So that will all be coming out to you again at the end of the week when we get our email together. So if you have specific questions, you want to add them in the chat about what you've seen on the slide, but hopefully we've addressed some of it. And we'll try to get to your questions in the chat, and then we'll have space later to do some Q&A out loud. But anyway, so things to consider as you get started, how staffing may look. How much time do you have to dedicate to this? Will you hire one or more positions now or later? Do you already have trained notaries or other volunteers that can be engaged? And for us, the notary is actually also the program coordinator. So yeah, and then what is the frequency or capacity for your project? All of those questions, again, will come out in another document as well, so that you have those questions as a reminder to you.
I think the general sense here that we're hoping to impress upon you is that we're going to try to explain to you how we've navigated these questions and set up the programs in ways that we hope are sustainable for us and meet community needs, but that doesn't mean that that's how you have to do it. So if you can see these questions and see the conversation and be like, oh, well, I know that we have this amazing quilting group and they meet every Thursday and maybe they could blah, 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 then like the idea is to help you think through how you can use where you're already at to start something that your community needs. Not, here's how you have to do it, here's the model, and it only works if you do it this way, because I don't think that's how it works.
Yes. So yeah, here's again the kind of the ways it looks for both of us, but more interesting will be what you need to consider for yourselves.
And so I think we would start, when I think about partnerships, is relationships, right? And I kind of breezed through that at the beginning, but how we came into this was through being in relationship in different community spaces. So showing up to ecumenical clergy meetings, showing up to hub spaces that we were trying to actually listen and find out if there's a need for another hub or investment in one of the existing hubs, showing up to some of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition calls and learning about how laws are changing and what the impacts are and who's going to be disproportionately impacted by those changes. And so then what are the needs and responses we should be acting on. So I think the relationships are really key. So I think the next piece is like not just relationships with people that know what's going on, but relationships with the directly impacted community or the community that you're trying to reach through with these services or through this kind of program. Tabernacle Community Development Corporation said, we know that our people need this. We know that the people in our neighborhood are asking for these things and we don't know where to send them, or we send them to the College Church and they can't get there, or they don't know how, or they don't feel comfortable because they've never been to College Church, right? But they know us. So how do we serve people where they're at? I think the other question is who has capacity and resources, right? So being in those relationships, our organization found a place to say, well, we have some capacity and resources, but I don't have the knowledge of running this program for 30 years, and I don't have the relationships in this part of the community. So that necessitated us being in relationship with each other. So how do you sort of evaluate or even map out your own relationships as they exist right now to figure out who do you need to partner with deeper? Who's going to be really strategic for you to pull into your table to make this successful? I think there's also a space about additional relationships that you might need to be in or be aware of for referrals or additional services you can like bring into your spaces. So for us, we have felt it's really important to have voter registration at at both of our clinics so far, every single one of them too. But the League of Women Voters has been there both times. offering voter registration services. So are there other resources that you already work with that could be in this space too, that would make it a more fruitful relationship building space for your organization or congregation in the community? And then I think, what is the team of experts that you can compile or I'm already a part of for troubleshooting and like debriefing as you grow? For me, that's been St. Francis Xavier, right? So almost every time, weekly, I get to be in spaces talking about, well, here's how it went. I ran into this thing, one applicant asked this question, and we have a space for that. And so Madeline and I are going to invite you into just one of those spaces by the end of this evening. Whoops. Did I skip? No.
Cool. So yeah, there's a lot to consider once you get thinking about the physical space where you will do this. And that is totally going to depend on the space you have and what you want to do. You can go to the next slide. Great. Perfect. So something that I think is very important to consider, particularly because of just like knowing who we tend to see, and people show up to use our service because funding is an issue for them. And so many different things likely fall from, or a person might be experiencing a lot of things because of, we can probably assume some of the things they're experiencing. So public transportation is something that gets used very frequently in our part of the state. And now that might be different in the rural parts of the state. And I'll be so curious actually to continue that conversation now that I've just said it out loud. But so we happen to be off of a bus line, which is, it's extremely important. The other thing that's really important is that we are close to, there's a DMV a couple blocks away, and then we're 2 miles from the city hall downtown, but there's some proximity to the offices that people will end up going to after they see us. ADA accessibility is also pretty crucial. We've got a ramp, so that's been really important as we consider where we would move when we outgrew our original space. Yeah, so some of those things you have no control over. We really just by chance are seated where we are, and it just so happens we're really close to those things. So this has been a helpful service we can provide. Something else to consider: many people who are experiencing homelessness may need a place to mail their documents. So would you be able to provide that at the organization you are with, or wherever you are? That's something to consider. So the third question: is there capacity to invite additional services to be present? So yeah, Sarah mentioned the voter registration piece. That's really kind of the most crucial one. One thing I think of actually that is happening currently at College Church, a social worker from the VA has been there each week, just kind of, if he sees that someone is a veteran, he'll end up working with them. So, kind of where can you cross some wires and double up for people? And additionally, is childcare a potential option? We've definitely seen that, like, sometimes people are coming in with their kids and it's just a challenge. And if any of you are parents, you know that that's a really nice thing to be able to offer. Snacks and refreshments, always great. So if you can provide them, love it.
I think actually hearing you say this, Madeline, one thing that can come to my mind is like, if these are questions and we're answering them in the ways that we do them, but like maybe this goes back to the relationship or the partnership slide of like, well, who are you already in relationship and partnership with that you could engage for this, right? Is there already a youth group at your congregation that could come hang out for 2 hours or 4 hours, or maybe get paid, see the finance budget rain kicking in, right, to show up and do this? So I think it's like, what's the equity lens that you can use to ask these questions that make most sense for your particular location? And I think the other side sometimes of equity is component of equity is being really transparent, right? If you are not ADA accessible and that's just what you're dealing with, you got to say that up front so that people don't show up with an expectation that they will have access. So it's not the like solution, right? But But I think that's really helpful, especially from a startup mode, is if you're just trying to get it off the ground, just be really transparent about what you're able to do and what you're not able to offer.
I like that point. Yeah. Thanks for saying that. And yeah, because certainly if you answered no to some of those things, like doesn't mean stop now, you can't continue. So yeah, it'll work. You'll make it work.
I think we kind of talked about the program hours and how that's working already. But maybe some considerations there that we haven't directly named is about like, what's the turnaround time for startup? So if you are trying to make this happen tomorrow, then I think you got to ask some of those questions from that lens. I do see some questions in the chat, so I'm going to finish my thoughts on this slide and then we'll pause for those questions. So if you're trying to like make this happen before the November elections, then you're on a pretty short timeline, and that might mean you probably have to have budget already taken care of and relationships already taken care of, right? Some of us are thinking like, well, let's get this going, but also we're playing a long game and looking 2 years from now, right? And so what do we have to do to build this program and sustain it so that we are at a critical mass for things that matter to us in 2024, right? So just thinking about what's your turnaround time, and what are your staff and volunteers that are currently available, right? So if you have nothing right now and you're like, I want to take this to my pastor because I think our church needs to do this, versus I'm the one that can give 20 hours a week to this, or I have a group and together we can do 40 hours a week, whatever that is, I think is maybe going to dictate some of the ways that you start. So if you're trying to have a daily clinic for the next like 6 weeks, that's going to require a certain level of capacity than what perhaps you're able to offer right now. I think one other question that we've experimented with is when could your program be most accessible to the people most needing it? So for example, we did our first clinic on a Thursday morning and afternoon, and we did our second clinic on a Saturday morning and afternoon. And between those two, I mean, sample size 2, but for what it's worth, we saw twice as many people on the Thursday than we did on the Saturday. So that is like interesting to me, but now we might have to test that out again with our third clinic and schedule it during the week and see what happens. But I think thinking about the community that you know and when that could be accessible, when you need to be available so that the people who need it can reach you, versus I have a bunch of volunteers who can do it on a Saturday afternoon. And if the community that you're trying to reach isn't available on a Sunday afternoon, don't do it then. I think similarly, like, is this a one-time clinic or is this something you're going to sustain? So my just like blatant recommendation or blunt recommendation for a one-time clinic is the big investment has to be upfront in communications. People have got to know that you're going to be there way in advance. They need to know when to show up, what to bring, all of that. You have to drill that into people before you show up. Otherwise, I think the big risk, which our program, the first version of it from a year ago saw, is that people won't show up or won't believe it's going to be there or won't trust that it's going to be there or won't know, right? And so communications up front versus we're going to be here every week, St. Francis style, and there's a flyer that says like every week from this time to the right. Similarly, appointments and walk-ins only, especially in terms of capacity, that's a big question. So if you are doing appointments, you have to have someone who can coordinate all of that in advance. If you're doing walk-ins only, you have to have enough capacity there, which, as some of my volunteers can attest to, might mean that volunteers sit there without much to do if everyone comes during one period of time and not the other. And then I think thinking also in your program hours about pre and post event communications along those lines of like who's doing all the communication ahead of time and following up. I do see a question in the chat about HB 1878. So I'm going to circle back to that because I do have some information about that and things we can share, but definitely heard around voter registration, which is why we have the League of Women's Voters do it. They're already all registered as solicitors under the new law. And so having them there as an organization providing that service doesn't means that our volunteers don't have to assume the new burden of that, but great point about that. Bill, let me come back to that one, if that's all right. I think we have a couple other pieces to touch on that will be helpful to come back to that question in a couple minutes, if that's all right with you.
That's great. Oh, I just wanted to make one kind of statement about the communication piece and how important that is. We did a survey of like 250 guests at some point in the spring. And I think it was something like 40% of people had heard of our program from word of mouth. So yeah, it can't be overstated how much communication actually will need to be pushed and pushed out to all creative parts of your networks. So onto equipment and technology. So yeah, again, this is like, so here we are, we have been doing this for a while. So we have a lot of technology that we rely upon. There's also a place in which you can probably do this with paper. It depends on how much data you need to be tracking for what you're doing for what your funds might require. Maybe you don't have to track at all. We mostly track just because we rely on grants, so we do need to report some information. So we've ended up moving into using databases, and we've got our iPads for the volunteers to be using. But again, like that could come from a Google form that can get printed. So there are definite ways to like go from paper to many computers. So yeah, keeping in mind what your costs are. If you really just want to be providing this service, like you may want to devote all your finances to the payment of the documents. These are all things you'll want to be considering. Yeah, how many folks are you hoping to serve? And I think initially when it's a smaller scale, like you may not need much technology, but if that scale gets large, the technology will be helpful. Yeah, again, data tracking, I kind of touched on that. So depending on your funding sources, that's going to be dictated to you pretty quickly. And you'll just figure out what works best for you. And again, we use a program called Airtable. You can do a lot of this through Google as well. Paper is great. I still love it.
Yeah, I think I kind of think about equipment and technology in two ways. One is like on the back end, which to me includes volunteer recruitment, volunteer engagement, organizing, coordinating volunteers. Like when volunteers sign up, you have to have a way for them to do that, and then like communicate with them about changes or plans or trainings. And then the other piece is the technology or equipment that's needed to run the clinic, to do the service, right? And so, you know, like Madeline said, like you can do most, if not all of it, on paper, especially if you print a bunch of it in advance, right? So I think there's not you have to have 10 iPads or 4 laptops. We bought 4 laptops, found them on Amazon for $250 each. And so that's what we did for our first one. I think doing it in sort of a pop-up style without a lot of notice makes it maybe more challenging for folks to be there. So like I've thought about having, you know, community events or like a community fair, and people have said like, oh, can you come table? And like, do it. And I think that's a little challenging because it takes a minute to sit with a person and go through what are all of the things, how are they going to do it? How are you going to write a check? What if they're doing it online? Like, how do you have access to that when you're in the middle of a park somewhere? So I think the logistics get more complicated for me in like in a come to our church and do this thing kind of event versus a like home base, we're going to do it in this way. But that doesn't mean it can't be done that way. It just might shape what technology you use and how you offer the services.
This is where it gets fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess let's just move right into the slide. So I put together a couple of very bare bones, like a birth certificate in Missouri costs $15 and a non-driver ID costs $18. So there are, if that is all that you have the funding to put towards, like these are some scenarios. One is you could use technically like the Show It to Vote program, which provides a free ID for voting. for any eligible Missouri resident. You could totally utilize that program and spend none of your own dollars if you were to just support people walking through that process. It is not called Show It to Vote anymore, I don't think. So that's new information since HB 1878 officially went into effect. But that's all if you were to use the Secretary of State's funding. Now, something that we tend to do is we'll pay for the birth certificate because it's just faster for a person to, like, especially if they're going down to City Hall where there is a vital records and a DMV in the same spot. If they go and say they need their ID to vote, they may end up getting hung up on the birth certificate. Then it takes a lot longer. So we just bypass that, pay for their birth certificate, and then they go do the Show It to Vote. And that looks like you're not paying the $18, but you would pay $15. I utilized $100 as your like base in these instances. And if it's 100 people you serve, however many times you want to see two people a week, like you might spend $1,500.
Madeline, can you say really quickly, sorry to interrupt you, how many people does your clinic see a week? Or a month?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess, well, it sort of depends. We've kind of been cutting it now at like 70 people, but the thing is, it's hard to figure out exactly how much we spend per person, because some people will come in and need like 5 birth certificates for their children. So it's not like a perfect, but let's say 70 people a week.
And so by comparison, we've run 2 clinics. We saw about 20 people the first one and 10 people the second one. So that's not this is a sample size 3, right? or 2, depending on how you cut it. But there's 100 written on here, and I just want folks to have some perspective of where our numbers are at.
Yeah. So yeah, like that's 1 week with us, and you can then cut it, like we're now trying to scale that back. Like, okay, we will only, once we hit our 60th person, we're closing the doors that day. So, wherever you need to end it, like that'll end up being what you need to do. And so if you add in the ID, you might look at $3,300 for 100 birth certificates and 100 non-driver ID. And then
so
we'll get
sorry, go ahead.
Sarah, more detail oriented in this next phase, as she's just recently started this up.
So if you don't like spreadsheets, close your eyes and ignore this slide. But this is my attempt to take, when I was first talking with St. Francis and figuring out what it was going to need to be for us, this was my attempt to come up with a budget. So again, we'll share all of this if you find this helpful. If not, just tune me out for a minute, because I know this kind of format is not always helpful for some. One thing that, so we are renting space in a community building that is where we're trying to serve. So that's that first line item there. We are also we made an initial purchase of some bus passes so that we could hand out free bus passes to make sure that folks who needed them could get to the bus, to the buildings where they process the documents. We started with a 4 laptop we started with an investment of 4 laptops. We bought a printer. We paid for a Google Voice phone. All of this, by the way, is budgeted for 1 year. So this is a 12-month budget here, and they're all over the place. This is like big estimates here in terms of what we might actually spend. Obviously, some other supplies, envelopes, toner, paper, those sorts of things. I had to buy checks, right? Because part of it is writing checks as an organization. Postage and application fees. So for our numbers, we estimated $22 per person, and we estimated $60 per month. So those numbers came from an average of the 15 plus 18, and not everyone needing both. And we took what St. Francis sees in a week and said, maybe we'll see that in a month. We have not seen that in a month yet. And we're two months in. So that is grossly under budget at this point. And based on the previous slide, right, you can tweak those numbers to what you're able or not able to. You can also create policies for like how frequent you can serve people, or if you're able to do this, but not that, or pay for one or the other if your budget demands it, right? We have some budget for like marketing, so flyers, social media posts, press releases, if you're into that. And then technology, we're using Google Suite, Google Suite. So like Google Sheets, Google Docs, Google Forms, Google Sites. And then we have also used, our organization pays a subscription to Donor Perfect as a database and a subscription to Constant Contact for mass marketing emails. So we're using both of those systems, but they're not fully dedicated to this, right? So that was a place of like, oh, well, we already have this. Let's put it to use for this purpose. So we're looking at maybe $23,000, $25,000 for a year-long budget of this program, paying everything for everyone and giving bus passes. So maybe some questions there. If you are going to be writing checks to pay for certain things, what kind of additional policies you might need to come up with? If you're a nonprofit, do you need a special like board or internal policy? Is it one check signer? Is it two? So you might have to think about those logistics. Do you need to set up a voucher system with your local offices? So St. Francis has systems set up with the vital records and the DMV so that they can basically have an account that they give vouchers out to at the clinic, at their clinic, and then people use it. So there's not a check passing transfer through the individuals at the clinic, right? That could be something that we might grow into, but for starting, I didn't think like it was necessary. That felt a little cart before the horse on our end. So I'm writing checks, which is sometimes a bottleneck at the clinic. But what is your project budget overall? What do you have in the bank already? What you need to raise in order that you can do this? Who do you know that can donate or has access to some of these, right? So part of why we're renting at the hub is because they have Wi-Fi available in the whole building and I don't have to pay for that or start a new contract for it. We're not paying for parking. We're not paying for a security guard. We're not paying for renting tables and chairs, right? It's all there. Staff, we talked about that a little bit. What additional existing free additional and existing free resources can be leveraged for your model to be successful, right? So we talked a little bit about some of the voucher programs, but what else do you already know of that's available in your area that you can integrate into this project? And we talked a little bit about sustainability, like, are you trying to do this one time before the October 12th voter registration deadline? Then like that's a budget. Versus you want to do this every year until the November 2024 elections. That's a different budget, right? And then thinking about restricting or limiting the number of people you can serve or how frequently you can serve them or price per person, right? Madeline already mentioned like a mom and 4 kids and they all need birth certificates. Maybe you say it's like 1 per family or 2 per family, not as a way to say like, we can't serve you, but as a way to say like, we're trying to serve as most people, or I think there's some really challenging equity questions to be asked there. But I think if you're looking at budget, that those are the kinds of questions you should be asking. Madeline, anything else you want to add to finances?
No, I think that is very good.
Okay, we have like 2 more pieces and then we'll add a question break here. So hang in there for like 9 more minutes.
We're so close. All right. So yeah, how are we getting this information out to the people who need the service? And that looks like every angle you can think of, because you never know who's finding it on Facebook or at the, the social service agency they're at, and then they're in communication. So just get it everywhere. The libraries are great. Great places to see them. I've seen them down at my local branch, and it's yeah, everywhere you can think and keep thinking. Additional things to consider. So if you want to offer appointments, is there a way in which you will have people communicating with you to set those up? Is there an additional phone line for that? We use Google Voice, so we don't have to like tie up our own cell phones. Yeah. And then additionally, like, will that be like, in our case, it's its own role as when we ask for a volunteer, like a separate person is in charge of checking the voicemails. We already touched on this, but we like yeah, keep in mind that some people need a mailing location. We also have recently made a big breakthrough, and really a big shout out to Christine, our director of social ministry, and the Missouri ID Access Coalition for their work on this. But there's a form through the Department of Revenue that allows actually, I'm not saying this best, but social service agencies to kind of claim or allow people to use their address. And you don't have to just be a shelter, an overnight shelter. So we'll share that with you later as well. Yeah, consider, is it walking up or is it an appointment? What's going to work best for you? And then what will that eligibility be? That ties right back into your finances. What ways do you need to restrict it? Because we all have limitations. So for us, we see people once every 2 years and they can't come before that. So
I think the key to communications is the relationships, partnerships from the beginning. So making sure that you are communicating in the spaces that your message needs to be received, which might not always be the spaces that you are currently in. So I think that's an important ask. Volunteer recruitment. I think we've talked a little bit about this. Similarly, it's like same anywhere, everywhere, leveraging your existing networks. Sorry, Madeline, go ahead. Did you want to talk about volunteer recruitment at St. Francis?
Oh, well, I guess just, yeah, like we push it out through the parish bulletin, but at this point, like we have people, some of the folks in the parish who've just kind of been with the program for so long, it's like you kind of end up taking it for granted. But we offer some shadow experiences for new folks, and this invitation is to anyone. We've actually, I think, someone on the line, maybe from Kansas City, at least their agency has come by. So I mean, it's very exciting to get to share the work with you. So if you have any interest in coming down to see it on Tuesday, you're welcome to do so. This I think is similar to the service. Like, how are you letting participants know? Like, just again, utilize all your angles to let other people know that this is an option for volunteering and we'd love your help. So communicate.
Yeah, for sure. I think the only considerations maybe that I would touch on here is thinking about who, right? So who is going to design and lead trainings? Like, who is going to manage the volunteer like coordination? Like, who's going to do that piece of it? I think there's another point here about training. So I think, like, what additional training or what training is your group already doing that maybe sets your group up really nicely to take this kind of project on? If you're already doing anti-racism training, anti-bias training, democracy and voter engagement training, election protection training, like there are other things that you can integrate into showing up in this way, right? So for us, I think this is an and. We are going to offer this, and we are going to work to change the systems that necessitate programs and services like this to move forward. I think asking about equity-centric decisions in volunteer recruitment. So where are you recruiting? How are you recruiting? Are you compensating your volunteers in any way? Are you going to feed them while you're there? Are you going to, have multilingual volunteers or services in more than one language? So I think that there are questions there that, again, are intended to help you think about who are you in relationship with, who are you trying to serve, and where can you connect those dots. And then I think the other piece here I would think about is with regard to training or knowledge around reporting and data collection, because that's another piece of this, as we talked about previously. So when you're recruiting volunteers, who's doing that recruiting? And do you have to have someone else who's doing data entry or data tracking or data analysis? Is that some volunteers that you want to recruit, or does that need to be paid staff? Michelle, we are right at the end here. So I wanted to answer your question because I just saw it there. So I think Madeline, do you want to talk about Thursday really quickly? Give a plug for that.
Yeah. So this Thursday will be our like inaugural getting everyone together who has either started a clinic or wants to be starting a clinic. And Michelle, I think that's a really, really good point that like, if you are not in a position to facilitate one of these clinics, there's very likely a way in which you can support the work. And I think there's a lot of unknowns about what that means yet. And I am really excited for us to be getting that conversation going, which can happen tonight, can happen later on through email, or it can happen Thursday when we get more people together. But so my answer, I think, is just, yes, let's talk, figure out what are the resources we all have. And funding really will be a huge issue that we have to all get creative on. And I think that's what's really exciting about on Thursday, getting like the regional groups together. How can we support each other in our more local part of the state? There's a lot of creativity that we got to tap into. And
so maybe we can, sorry.
I was just going to say that I think there was that additional question from William up at the top. Maybe now is a good time to come back to that.
Sure. Go ahead. You want to take it?
No, go ahead. No, sorry. I was going to say, do you want to answer it? Go ahead.
Okay. My first reaction is, I think it's possible for an all volunteer group to start a clinic with no paid staff. I think that's totally doable. I think you should have, the challenge for me would be being really clear about roles from the get-go, and maybe thinking about like who's doing, for me, having 4 people share a Google Voice line, and like we did this in another project in my former organization, where it was like we had volunteers that were sort of staffing the, like, we called it a warm line, not a hot line. It was like not hot all the time, but like you would get a call back within 24 hours. And it got really challenging to track who called which person back or responded to what message. And so I think like thinking about what breaking down all of the roles so that you have a volunteer coordination space that's like, I'm doing this piece, you're doing that piece, and being really clear about that feels like the part that has to be like most worked out before in order for that sort of model to be successful. I don't think there's any reason that it could, that it can't be done that way. I think it's a bit of a challenge for me to imagine like holding all of that.
Paul, you have another question that's, I'm wondering if I could pull up that document right now.
Yeah.
I know it's linked. Let me find it.
So I'm going to give you some context while Madeline's digging for the documents. So as she mentioned, there's 2 documents, one at the DM for the Department of Revenue and one for vital records that can be used in different ways for people who are unhoused, or I think the language they use is unaccompanied youth, and how those work and what they need and what purpose they serve in getting the documents. So it looks like you have one up here. That's great.
Yeah. So this is, I kind of totally forgot about the additional component. We get much more into the details of this in the round 2 of training. But so this is what the form is. Okay, the certification of homeless status. So this, for purposes of this form, a homeless service provider includes, and what is included is so broad that really anyone helping someone that has an address that they can use is able to use that address. So we are a church, not a social not a provide, like, I don't know, it's kind of murky, but they leave the language so broad that pretty much anyone on this call is going to be able to use this.
Yeah, Madeline, so to ask a couple of questions here, and maybe you can share some of your expertise. So a couple of the people that we saw, not every recently, have said that their shelter, for example, doesn't allow them to receive mail or use that address. So for some reasons, so like if they have an address that they're able to use, they can. But this form would serve a purpose if someone doesn't have an address that they could use to receive mail. And I think the other thing that it does is serves as a proof of residency document that is one of the 5 or 4, depending, required document categories for getting a non-driver, non-real photo ID. And so you have to show proof of residency. And in that list of 25 documents, it's think of like utility bills, mortgage payment, like whatever those things are that have your address on them. If you're unhoused or living in a shelter, you might not always have one of those documents. This form, if it is signed by an agency that meets this very broad definition of a homeless service provider, then this form itself serves as that requirement. Does that answer your question, Paul?
I'm gonna stop sharing for now.
You're welcome to hop off.
Yes, but we've, again, depending on who we contact, we've received different answers. I'll have to read that form more carefully.
That, and it is pretty, I think it just came into existence in July. So it's like potentially people aren't aware of it yet. So share it, definitely.
So our agency made the decision that we could sign that form, and we've done, I think we have used it 3 times. I think so far, where one of them I know, like, it means that our address gets printed on their ID and the ID gets mailed to us, and that they were able to get it. So she didn't have to come up with other documents in order to prove that she's a Missouri resident. That my attestation as an agency serving her proved that she was a Missouri resident, if that makes sense. That's how I understand it. But I definitely hear getting mixed answers from the Secretary of State. That has also been my experience recently.
Any other questions on the tons of information that was just shared? We're past 7 o'clock now. So if you were only planning to be here until 7, the next part is, well, one, we are recording, so you can certainly hop off and we'll share the recording with you. This will also be available in the follow-up training part 2. But if you're able to stick with us, we can maybe, I guess, are we ready to keep going?
Yeah.
I'll try to condense a lot of what I'm realizing, like I'll try to keep it really brief.
Great question. To my knowledge, there is not a limit of how many times an agency can use that form. So I think, has that been your experience, Mel?
Yeah, there is no limit. We have not been limited.
To our knowledge, right? Like,
I'm pretty sure.
Working with the Secretary of State during this particular year has been somewhat unique in that the laws are changing. And so frequently we also receive different information depending on who we talk to. So we're doing the best with what we've got. Okay, the next 20 minutes, we're going to condense a 90-minute presentation into 20 minutes to give you just like an overview of the 3 in-state, out-of-state ID, the 3 kinds of documents that we process at the clinics and what that process generally looks like. And then we will have 10 minutes or so at the end to talk about next steps and go.
We're starting with the IDs because that's generally what people show up first and foremost for. And then they don't realize that there are some, like, you need a birth certificate, for instance. So we're starting kind of in the way in which someone might appear to you. There are 2 options for the non-driver ID. There is the non-real ID and there is the real ID. The real ID is going to be necessary for air travel starting May 2023 and also for accessing federal buildings. It is only different from the non-real ID requirements in the proof of Missouri residency, where it asks for 2 pieces of information instead of just 1. And typically where proof of Missouri residency kind of hangs up some of the people we see, generally we can just get the 1 piece of information. So we end up really focusing on just a non-real ID. You can use the non-real ID to vote. So it's a perfectly good ID to be using. Unless people want to be traveling. So that's a good distinction. It costs $18. So very quickly, what you need for the ID, you need to prove your identity. You need to prove your lawful status. A birth certificate, it covers both of those. So that's generally why we have people going with a birth certificate. You need to share your social security number. If someone has had their ID since 2013, they will only have to recite the social security number. They do not need the physical card. But if it is their first ID since that time or first ID period, they'll need their social security card or like a tax document that has their number on it. And then if there's a name change required, something might be like a marriage license. There's a more complete list, which we will share with you. But these are the most commonly used ones that we are familiar with. I already shared that form, so I think I'll move on. I think we're good. We have some flow charts, and I think, frankly, once you get them, the best thing to do is to look at them when you are in possession of them. And hopefully they are clear. They're very clear. They're helpful, especially for the volunteers to be referencing when trying to deliver the service. It's a very distinct, like, okay, do they have this? Yes or no? What's next? And it's really helpful getting through the process. So
sorry for the slide mismanagement.
Right.
The one other thing I was going to say is that perhaps it took me a minute to catch on when I was first learning about this whole like clinic model, that people don't walk away from a clinic with either of those documents in their hand. We are non-government agencies, and both birth certificates and photo IDs are issued by the government. And so the point of these clinics is to provide logistical and financial assistance for obtaining those documents for a Missouri non-real, non-driver photo ID. Also what people now are calling the voter ID, which is kind of a misnomer in my opinion. And we'll talk about that in a second. They have to physically appear in person at an office of the Department of Revenue, the motor vehicle office, right? So this work in the clinic is trying to make sure people have enough information and the financial means if needed in order to navigate those spaces more effectively. I think for someone with privilege like me, that is often easy to overlook, that if I go, it might take me 4 times and I have to wait in 3 lines for 3 hours each time. And then I have to go home and get another document, or I have to go get my card, blah, blah, blah. And that amount of going back and forth is something that I am blessed to be able to do, and not something that everyone in our community can do. And so the point of coming and investing time at the clinic is, yes, we'll probably pay for your documents. And we hope that that means when you get there, you get it done the first time. And so I think that's, for me, that feels like a big advantage. The flow charts that we talked about, we're going to go through that. Our volunteers so far have given really positive feedback. This is something that we'll share with you because St. Francis created it. I've modified it. Now I've watched St. Francis redo it and continuing to learn. So it's really, right here, just to have my inspiration of what we're doing and laugh, because a lot of our work is on it. So we're just going to keep contributing to it, keep going and building it. This is what it looks like for the state ID. I don't expect you to be able to see this easily on screen. So again, we'll share everything with you, but the idea is that you can kind of work through it. Have you ever had an ID? Yes or no? And then you follow the flow chart, right? For us, we've modified it so that you can see, for example, like, great, will we pay for it or not? Or should we use, can we use the free ID or not? And does it need to be notarized or not? And like, what's the internal processing? So this kind of chart should walk your volunteers through the whole process of what they're supposed to be doing each day.
Yeah, so then the free ID to vote, all Missouri residents who are eligible to vote. So that means being of the voting age, not currently on probation or parole, and then no felony conviction related to voter fraud. So if you are an eligible voter, you are eligible for a paid ID from the state. This is once in a lifetime. Sounds like so magical. But only one is only allowed to get one, only allowed to use this program one time. I think people would be pretty clear if they had used it or not, but sometimes people just don't know. And then that gets a little like, oh shoot, you know, are we sending them away without payment now? And, but generally people have not taken advantage of this program yet. So you can be pretty confident that someone could walk into the DMV and that they have to be given an ID. The Secretary of State's office will cover that. There is information linked. Things have changed a little bit just in the website since August 28th when the bill went into effect, but I don't think anything technically should have changed. So everyone who is an eligible voter is eligible for one ID and underlying documents as well.
So I want to talk very briefly about the change. And if you haven't, I can share some links at the end for a full presentation from others about House Bill 1878, which passed earlier this year and went into effect on August 28th. There are multiple provisions in 1878 that realistically work to suppress certain voters in Missouri and restrict access to the ballot in multiple ways. One of those ways is through increased restrictions on IDs to vote. Keep in mind that prior to this law, Missouri was already an ID to vote state. We already had photo ID laws in place. We restricted through this law the kinds of IDs that you can use at the polls. So it now has to, you cannot use a student ID. You cannot use the little voter card that the Secretary of State mails to you, which if I'm being honest, that's what I've used every year because it always has my polling location on it. I'm like, great, this is where I go. You cannot use any other ID. You can't use an expired driver's license. So if your grandma who hasn't driven, thank goodness, in 20 years, she can't use that old ID to vote anymore. Now, according to HB 1878, you have to have a valid Missouri issued non-expired driver's license or non-driver ID, or a federally issued ID like military ID or a passport. So you cannot use an out-of-state driver's license, even if you're voting as a Missouri resident. So anything else is out. Every single person who needs to vote in Missouri at the polls has to use a photo ID that is Missouri or federally issued. The other piece I'm going to say is that that law is being challenged in court. There are 2 lawsuits pending currently. We are hoping for a hearing by the end of September to know whether or not a judge will order an injunction or will pause the effect of these laws for the November elections. But currently they are in place and you will need a photo ID, Missouri or federally issued, non-expired, in order to vote in November. We'll share this one pager, which is created by the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, who's involved in both lawsuits. I'll share that with you. It goes through some other challenges and issues, but I know one was mentioned earlier about voter registration, which is also kind of wild. And actually we gave a presentation about it earlier this month, and so that should be on our website soon. But just wanted to make sure that we didn't get through this evening without mentioning that part of why many of us, I think, are paying attention to these kinds of clinics now, perhaps more than we were in the past, is because of this increased burden for Missouri voters now that must have an ID in order to cast their vote. Oops. So we'll make sure you have all that. Questions on Missouri photo IDs? All right, let's keep pushing. Missouri birth certificate.
Great.
Similarly, we have a flow chart for the Missouri birth certificate. Basically, I think the things that are helpful for me is that both for Missouri and out-of-state birth certificates, there's a list of who can apply. I can't just go and say that I want Paul's birth certificate. The state's going to be like, no, right? Like, and thank goodness for that. But there's a list of people in Missouri that includes immediate family immediate family members, authorized agents, a parent that's listed on the birth certificate, a guardian, foster parents, step parents, not cousins, not aunts and uncles, unless they meet one of those other categories. It's $15, and you need the completed application and a photo ID in order to get it. These would be the requirements for applying in person. There are some differences if you apply by mail or apply online. So for birth certificates, both in Missouri and out of state, sometimes there's an online option to apply, and Madeline's going to talk about that in a minute. Sometimes there's a mail-in option to apply, and some of those requirements are different. So sometimes you just need a notarized signature, like to obtain a Missouri birth certificate. You can fill out the form and mail it in. If your signature is notarized, you don't have to send in a copy of your photo ID. And so that is like some of the advantage and the pros and cons of which method you use to get the birth certificate. The flow chart for birth certificates look like this. So if you have a state or photo ID and you meet the requirements of who can apply for it, you can walk into a vital records office and get one on the spot. We frequently send folks to City Hall, especially if they want both documents, because they walk to one end and they get the birth certificate, get it certified copy right then and there, and they walk to the other end and they can wait in line at the DMV and apply for their photo ID there.
Yeah, and I think the one other thing to like give your local vital records office a call and just double check like exactly how tight are they about if there's no photo identifying document, what will work. Like we know that we've had success with maybe like a looser definition of what the secondary document is, but you'll want to be certain that you know what your vital records office will be. My child is screaming in the background. I'm so sorry.
Go for it. I'll keep us moving.
Can you see him? I don't know.
No, you're good.
Keep going.
All right. So out-of-state birth certificates, I'll go through this quickly so that we can get to Q&A. Similarly, most of the out-of-state birth certificates that we're going to apply for are going to be by mail. Clearly, out-of-state birth certificate offices also have in-person options, but unless the person who is in Missouri is planning to travel to that state to do it, we don't really concern ourselves with like how the in-person process works. For me, the thing here is that there's this online sort of mega system called Vital Check that actually I think serves most states. Most states use Vital Check for online processing. The thing that really grinds my gears about this is that this is a classic. If you have money, this is easier for you. And that really just irks me, but that's a soapbox for another day. But if you have money, you can get on Vital Check and pay sometimes 3-4 times as much as what it costs for mail-in or in person and get the application. Why on earth would you do that? Is 2 reasons that are listed here. 1, it's usually faster processing time, and 2, it usually requires less documents. So both times that we've used it so far, totally agreed, Anita. Fees are overboard insane, literally makes my blood boil, in case you couldn't tell. But if you have someone who doesn't have a bunch of documents, what Vital Check often uses are those bogus security questions that kind of creeps me out of how systems work. But the things where it's like, I'm sure you've seen them. Have you identified with any one of these addresses in the last 5 years? And then it lists a bunch of addresses. Is the make and model of your dad's car ever been one of these? And you like answer those kinds of identity verification questions. Again, kind of creeps me out. Soapbox for another day. But if you can use those and verify your identity, then you don't have to submit 1,200 other documents that you may or may not have if you're in fact trying to get a birth certificate to get one of those other documents. That's my spiel. It can be really helpful. It is very costly. If you can avoid doing that and do a mail-in, that's definitely going to be cheaper, but you might run into obstacles about processing time, and about documents. I think most states right now, we're saying 4 to 6 weeks in order to process a birth certificate by mail. I think you probably know better than I do. Some states definitely going to take longer than that.
Yeah, I think one, like maybe New York or Mississippi was like 3 months.
I-
Totally depends. Hard to know too.
This is what our out-of-state birth certificate, exactly. You're totally right. Danita, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Pop in if I'm not. But the information when you submit mail-in, basically you have to set a timer after you mail it in. And if you don't get your stuff, then you have to start calling and say, why didn't I get my thing? And then they'll tell you if it's because there was an error, but you won't get any nice little postcard that says like, sorry, we couldn't process your application because blah, blah, blah. They just don't do it. And so that is a trick. A trick, this may be a nice way to say that. Okay, this is what our flow chart looks like. Both digitally and in print, we have lists of requirements for each state, links to the documents. In this box, you can see, actually, this is what I use during clinics. I have folders or alphabetized. Thank you to my volunteer who alphabetized them on Saturday, so that you can pull out the out-of-state application and fill it out on the spot. You can also fill them out online or print them off online. So we will share all of those resources with you too. Okay, pausing for questions.
Yeah, so I did mention, like, we have this big Google Doc with all the states linked, and that will be included in what's sent out to you. There was maybe one other thing I wanted to add, but question. Oh, yeah, I don't know if you caught this or if we made it clear, but like, in order to get your ID, you need your birth certificate, and in order to get your birth certificate, you need a photo ID. So it's just become so complicated. So this really ends up being just such an important service. So thanks for showing up tonight. Our next steps look like Thursday. Ooh, can we get that link in the chat, Sarah? That's great. Thank you. Please register for that. We'd love to have you there. It's an 11 a.m. meeting. We are just, one second. We are just getting that going. I think it should remain maybe hopefully a standing meeting on is that the third Thursday, perhaps? If that time does not work out, please let us know, especially if you want to be there, you just can't be there. We'll figure out how to remain connected. We will have an email following up with a whole file full of lots of things for you. So the PowerPoint slides, this recording, that out-of-state document that I mentioned, links to birth certificate applications, all kinds of things. So we will set up a date in the coming days and figure out when we will be offering the full training for the volunteers, which of course each of you are welcome to be at. And maybe that ends up being something you can just now take with you and train your volunteers as you need. Both Sarah and I are available by email and would love to be in communication with you on whatever it is that you need and however we can support you. Do I need to look for that link again? Sorry. Did we find it? Cool. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. I think that's kind of it. That was a lot. There's a lot that just happens as you start to set this up, and you may run into lots of questions at that time, and we're happy to.
I think the last thing that we were going to talk about was don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. I think we started this by saying that we are here co-learning together, and that we are all sharing different amounts of information and knowledge and experience. So I think it's finding that balance, that unique balance in between pursuit of equity and not getting stuck in the planning process, which then denies people access to the resources that we have to offer, right? So I think I look forward to continuing to be part of the conversation with you. And our email addresses are on the screen currently. We'll pop them in the chat. And then, like we said, by the end of the week, we will share you an email with copious amounts of links and details to things. And I certainly hope that you will join us on Thursday so that we can continue our conversations and maybe go deeper into some brainstorming and planning about how-tos at your specific level. So with that, I think we'll pause. And if there's any questions, I know we're right at 7:30. Thank you for sticking on this long. But I'm happy to stick around for 5 minutes or so to answer questions.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time. It's time is precious, so thank you for being here.
And if you don't have any questions, you are welcome to end the meeting, log out, go eat dinner, do the things that you need to do this evening, and we'll see you soon. Awesome. Sounds good, Cindy. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll make sure to get that recorded.
All right. That's a wrap. Thanks, everyone. We look forward to talking to you soon.